I'd like to begin tonight with a story. In the year 1530, the evangelical preacher Bernd Rothmann appeared in the Westphalian city of Münster. Rothmann was a Lutheran, and his sermons were characterized by an uncompromising stance towards the traditional Roman Church. Its mass was abominable idolatry, its priests morally bankrupt, and the local bishop, who also happened to be Münster's temporal overlord as well, more wolf than shepherd with regards to his flock. Over the course of 3 years, Rothmann's preaching attracted an increasingly influential cadre of city burghers who found his religious and political message appealing. They protected Rothmann from persecution, ensured that he kept his pulpit, and worked to stack the city government with those sympathetic to his evangelical teachings. By the end of 1533, their efforts ensured that Münster was deadlocked, with evangelical and Catholic parties at loggerheads over the governance and spiritual direction of the city. Now, of course, in 1533, a situation like this would have been relatively common in the Holy Roman Empire. The spread of evangelical reform from cities such as Wittenberg and Zurich in the previous decade had led to the outbreak of many urban reformations in the German lands, and the impasse that Münster found itself in had been repeated in dozens of cities from Danzig to Strasbourg. But it was at this point that Münster's Reformation swerved. Dutch Anabaptists, inspired by the visions of the imprisoned furrier-turned-itinerant preacher Melchior Hoffmann, arrived in Münster, proclaiming their belief that the city was meant to serve as a refuge during the imminent ascendance of Antichrist. Led by two men claiming to be prophets, Jan Mathis and Jan van Leyden, the Anabaptists had a dramatic impact on Münster's evangelicals. Many, including Rothmann, accepted adult baptism in February 1534, and their rapidly growing body of sympathizers marginalized both the Lutherans and Catholics within the city. The city's former prince bishop had also begun to mobilize for war to eliminate the heretics, and the combined threat led most non-Anabaptists to flee the city. This exodus allowed the Anabaptists to dominate urban elections in 1534, so they controlled the city politically, legally, and religiously by the middle of that year. In the following months, as the bishop and his allies besieged the city, and after Jan Mathis was killed in an ill-advised sortie, the city's Anabaptist leaders radically reordered life in the city. Jan van Leyden first established a council of 12 elders to oversee political affairs before setting himself up as the king of a restored Davidic monarchy. In his newfound kingdom, van Leyden instituted community of goods and polygamy, decisions that were inspired by the pragmatic exigencies of the siege, but were also redolent of biblical precedents. Under their king's leadership, the Münsterites also began to remake the physical fabric of their city. Clocks and bells were dismantled, for instance, and plans were made to level Münster's churches. After all, in a new and eternal Jerusalem, time didn't matter and all space was sacred. But van Leyden's plans extended beyond Münster's walls. He therefore sent 28 emissaries out from the city who broke through the siege lines to carry an invitation to all Anabaptists to join the Münsterites in their war against the world. And while these messengers failed to gather the 144,000 prophesied in Revelation 7, most spectacularly when a flotilla of armed pilgrims from Amsterdam were stopped on their way to the city, their mission laid bare the aspiration of Jan van Leyden to gather in the elect who would fight against the forces of Antichrist and purify the world in preparation for Christ's second coming at the edge of the sword. Now, the Münster Anabaptist plans for apocalyptic war did not go off as van Leyden had planned. One of his apostolic messengers was captured and betrayed the city, which was subsequently stormed on June 25th, 1535. After the city's fall, van Leyden, his chief queen, and several of the elders of the New Jerusalem were interrogated and executed. As a warning of the consequences of heresy, van Leyden's and two other men's bodies were hung in cages from the steeple of the Church of St. Lambert in town. You can see them on the tower in the left woodcut from the 16th century. 3 cages are still there today, a grisly reminder of the city's unique religious past. But how unique was it, really? There are different ways to answer this question. On the one hand, Munster was the only city I know of that established a renewed Israelite monarchy with universal pretensions in the early modern period. So it's totally idiosyncratic. But on the other hand, the 15th and 16th centuries witnessed a huge number of radical urban religious reform movements that also sought to remake the political order within European cities, whether in Zurich and Geneva, Magdeburg and Paris, or La Rochelle and York. Late medieval and early modern Europe was thick with theopolitical rebellions, and thus Munster was one of many. So, a second story, a little older than the first. In 1490, a Dominican friar arrived at the convent of San Marco in Florence. His name was Girolamo Savonarola, and he preached sermons filled with apocalyptic rhetoric that demanded the moral regeneration of the Tuscan city and of all Italy. We see him preaching here from a text, his Compendium of Revelations, published in the mid-1490s, and a famous 1498 portrait of him by Fra Bartolomeo, I believe. Savonarola had served in Florence before, but even he admitted that his first sermons in the city were disasters. He spoke haltingly. He had no confidence in his message. During his second tour, however, Savonarola appeared as a new man. He likened himself to Amos and Elijah, and he passionately expounded difficult texts from the book of Revelation. Even his rivals for the attention of the Florentine audience were amazed by the new power of Savonarola's words. One in particular, the Franciscan Giovanni Caroli, even remarked that Savonarola's, quote, sermons inflamed everyone's mind. It was as if the Spirit were talking through his mouth. As the years went on, Savonarola's yearly sermon cycles during Advent and Lent became hotly anticipated events. They only bolstered his reputation for prophetic inspiration. And his claims to divine guidance also became increasingly essential, as the death of Lorenzo de' Medici in 1492 and the ascendance of his son, known to history as Piero the Unfortunate, threatened the economic preeminence and political standing of Florence among the Italian powers. This incipient crisis came to a head in the autumn of 1494, when the French King Charles VIII led an army through Italy to press his claim to the throne of Naples. Piero's efforts to protect Florence's interests in the face of French aggression proved to be disastrous, culminating in his surrender of Florentine border forts to Charles while gaining nothing in return. This diplomatic disaster led to Piero's ouster from power, his exile from Florence, and the consequent removal of Medici clients from civic office. In the vacuum left by the Medici's fall, the prophet Savonarola stepped to the fore, negotiating Florence's survival with King Charles and gathering a faction around himself known as the Piagnoni, who helped to enact his plans for the reestablishment of republican government in the city. In the last months of 1494, Savonarola preached passionately in favor of a new Florentine constitution that would incorporate elements from both the Florentine and Venetian traditions of limited representative government. But over all these sermons hung the threat of the French, with whom Savonarola had treated and whose king the preacher identified as a new Cyrus, who had come to scourge the unrepentant Italy for its sins. Beyond the threat of the French army, Savonarola also held out a divine promise to his listeners in Florence. If they would reform themselves in their government, and if they would continue to heed the words of their prophet, then, quote, Florence would become richer and more powerful than she had ever been, and her empire would expand in many places. Spurred by Savonarola's alternating use of the prophetic carrot and stick, the city of Florence adopted many of the moral and political reforms he espoused. And while a combination of papal animosity and political infighting within Florence led to Savonarola's fall and execution in 1498, the republic he helped establish would survive until 1512, when the Medici returned in force. All right, one more story, a last story, a local story. At some point in the year 1418, can't say for sure when, or maybe by the year 1418, an apostate monk began preaching in the Church of St. Stephen's in Prague's new town. His name was Jan Żelivski, and the Prague he arrived in was a city on edge. As we've heard multiple times over the past couple of days, the city had witnessed the growth of a local reform movement over the previous 50 years, been characterized by popular preaching, Eucharistic devotion, and calls for moral reform based on the expectation of an imminent eschaton. For decades, that movement had flourished with the support of the Bohemian king, but the relationship between the crown and the reformers had soured by the year 1410. The leader of the reform at that time, the preacher and university professor Jan Hus, was actually exiled from Prague in 1412 for his refusal to obey his ecclesiastical superiors and his rejection of a certain indulgence supported by the king, Wenceslas IV. As is, I expect, well known to this crowd, Hus was subsequently summoned or invited to the Ecumenical Council of Constance in 1414 to explain his potentially deviant teachings. And despite the promise of a safe conduct from King Sigismund of Hungary, who was the brother and heir of the Bohemian king, Hus was arrested upon his arrival in Constance, tried, and executed for heresy on July 6, 1415. And this is really when things got interesting. In the wake of Hus's death, his former students and friends disputed the council's judgment against him. They allied themselves with a group of Bohemian nobles who similarly rejected the authority of Sigismund in the council, and this coalition created a national movement for reform based around the administration of communion of both kinds and the nascent veneration of Hus and his fellow martyr Jerome of Prague as saints. Over the ensuing years, this movement gained momentum. Its preachers took over pulpits, the pulpits of priests who stayed loyal to the traditional church. Its noble protectors seized ecclesiastical lands and installed Hussite preachers in their proprietary churches. In Prague, riotous processions and the proliferation of oral and visual propaganda broadened the appeal of the reformers' message. One moment on this. While increasingly radical theological voices were drawn to the city's dynamic religious atmosphere. Within a few short years, the reforming message of earlier preachers had gained a sharp, politically subversive edge. This is a later representation from the Jena Codex, which is a sort of famous pictorial manuscript from probably the end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century, with a sort of antithetical display of a procession of the Pope on the right, contrasted with the procession of Christ under his cross on the left. This type of propaganda, of course, is well known to 16th century scholars, from Cranach and Melanchthon's Passione Christi und Antichristi, but here we see that it has a sort of long history within the Czech domains as well. So, enter Jan Želivský onto this scene. He was one of the preachers who exposed the revolutionary potential of the Hussite message in 1419, when King Wenceslas suddenly tried to roll back the Reform Party's success in gaining public platforms for its message. The king forced Hussite preachers, including Želivský, from their churches, removed sympathetic political leaders from Prague city councils, and threatened the enforcement of edicts against heresy propagated by the new pope, Martin V. Wenceslas's efforts showed, however, a real failure to grasp the breadth and depth of the emergent Hussite party's appeal. Želivský, now preaching at the monastic church of Our Lady of Snows, gave incendiary sermons against the king and his allies throughout the summer of 1419. On July 30th of that year, he led a group of armed parishioners to the new town hall, where they perpetrated the first defenestration of Prague by tossing a group of councilmen appointed by Wenceslas, literally appointed on the 4th anniversary of Hus's death. This is bad timing. Out a window and into their deaths at the hands of a Hussite crowd gathered below. King Wenceslas died 2 weeks later, potentially from an apoplectic fit suffered in response to the uprising. After the king's death, his brother Sigismund and the Pope mobilized a crusade against the Bohemian heretics to help press his claim to the throne. The campaign culminated in a siege of Prague in July 1420, which was easily repulsed by the Hussites, and the seemingly divine validation of their reform emboldened the Bohemians to break from the church. I couldn't resist. For those of you who have not seen it, this is from the Slav epic by the 20th century painter Alfons Mucha, a series of truly monumental and, I have to say, mediocre paintings of a historical nature that's across the river in the north. Here is his reflection on the Hussite victory in the First Crusade, the Battle of Witkov Hill, which is graced now with the equestrian statue of Jan Žižka. And after these crusades failed, of course, over the next decade, a 15-year interregnum in the kingdom resulted. It's an era that's remembered today as the Hussite Revolution. So, although I've now described 3 cities and their radical movements for political and religious reform in some detail, I want to emphasize again that these were far from unique. In cities across the continent, and no less the countryside, uprising, rebellions, and revolts erupted across Europe from the end of the 14th to the beginning of the 17th century. In the Low Countries, a whole wonderful, unique vocabulary sprang up to characterize such collective actions in the cities. Takahan, Kokrul, and Mutmak were only 3 of the very idiosyncratic terms created to describe what contemporary observers witnessed all around them. But oddly enough, very few of these mass movements that scholars have documented from the 15th and 16th centuries have been granted the title of revolution. Clearly, the Hussites did. A solid decade of resisting holy war will do that for you. And the German scholar Peter Blickle has gamely attempted to rechristen the German Peasants' War as the Revolution of 1525, partially in order to recognize the urban elements in that uprising. But really, not much else has ever been considered, written about, or discussed in the historical literature as truly revolutionary. Which makes me wonder, first, why that is, and second, if it matters. Now, my suspicion is that it does. So what I'd like to do tonight is to examine how a comparative analysis of the 3 stories I began with might force us to reconsider the way that social scientists talk about revolution. You see, most historians, political scientists, and sociologists, and I'm really kind of thinking of more the Anglo-American tradition from the 70s and the 80s, sort of great comparative work by Charles Tilly and folks like that on revolution, reserve the title of revolution for the mass political movements that first arose at the end of the 18th and in the first half of the 19th century, a moment in time initiated by the staid success of the American Revolution and the spectacular self-immolation of its French counterpart. This age further encompassed a string of wars for independence that overturned the Spanish Empire in the Americas, starting in the 1820s, the widespread outbreak of Republican political movements across Europe in 1848, and the massive, truly disastrous Taiping Rebellion in China that erupted in 1850. Indeed, the concentration of both movements for independence from colonial powers and efforts to undermine the dynastic foundations of the Ancien Regime in these decades has cast a long shadow over the study of revolutions as a whole. Essentially, these movements have been used by modern scholars to establish an expected scale, that is the national, a repertoire of behaviors and a range of ideologies that are used almost as normative standards by which all other revolutionary aspirants are judged. In a very perceptive recent essay, the historians David Edelstein and Keith Baker argue that not only scholars, but actually revolutionary actors themselves have become aware of this repertoire, and that the leaders of subsequent revolutions often adopt or perhaps adapt the scripts that they inherit from previous revolutions. Whether in Russia, China, Vietnam, or Iran, 20th century leaders of revolutions have looked back to Paris, and less often Philadelphia, for templates they might employ. And even if the emplotment of revolution, according to extant scripts, is not always self-conscious, Edelstein and Baker forcefully argue that the external perception, the way outsiders look at revolutions, and the way they align the unfolding events with previous historical models, can often affect the course of events within the revolution in turn. Revolutionary scripting can thereby have a prescriptive effect, as well as its dominant retrospective orientation. I bring up the concept of the revolutionary script here because I think it's high time we write one for early modern religious uprisings. And in doing so, I want to elevate my cities and their reformers, and I think others as well, to the status of real revolutionaries. And to do this is not, I think, just to play a semantic game. Rather, by identifying religiously inspired rebellions from the 15th and 16th century as truly revolutionary, I'm pushing back on 2 assumptions, or maybe arguments, that have informed much of the historical scholarship on the origins and global spread of revolution. The first of these is that revolution is intrinsically modern. And the second is that Christianity cannot be truly revolutionary. Both of these assertions stem, I would argue, from an underlying Marxist-inflected, I always use the word Marx-ish, sort of belief that social and economic motives always drive revolution. That these secular concerns often have to confront and overcome the conservatism and ethic of obedience that's encoded in religions and especially Christianity's DNA. And while there's ample reason to accept this proposition, one need only think of the Apostle Paul's admonition in Romans 13 that everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. But despite this, there are simply too many historical examples of rebellion in the name of Christianity's God to accept this proposition uncritically. That's what we've been doing for the last 2 days, is thinking about all of the different manifestations of Christian ideology, theology, practice in revolutionary collective actions. And so, for the rest of my time this evening, I want to work from two directions to write a script for Christian revolution in the 15th and 16th centuries. First, I'll be working forward from the events that transpired in Münster, Florence, and Prague, as I've already described them. And along with a compilation of sort of key motifs and themes for our scripts from these cities, I'll also be working backwards, from a modernist definition of revolution that I've been wrestling with for the past couple of months. This definition comes from Hannah Arendt. She's in the title of my talk. I better talk about her. And I chose it because of the way she situated revolution within a broad political spectrum, at the far end from the totalitarian forces that she had seen nearly destroy her world. As such, Arendt had a sense of revolution's potential. Potential and importance in human history that crystallizes the stakes that I think are in play when we talk about what counts as revolutionary. For her, to be revolutionary was to dare to articulate a truly new set of social and political values that created spaces for human flourishing via meaningful participation in the public realm. But what I would like to add to Arendt's definition of revolution is an acknowledgement that overtly religious motivations and justifications could lead to this end, and that her narrowly defined sense of the political must be extended to incorporate the types of collective action that were characteristic of what I call late medieval and early modern religious revolutions. Maybe she needs to be thinking about politics in a Vogelian sense, we've heard about it the last 2 days, rather than her own. But before we work our way backwards from Arendt, here is a brief précis of the revolutionary script that I will argue developed in Prague, Florence, and Münster. I think that's my next. There we go. In each of these three cities, a radical religious reform movement arose that was instigated by charismatic preachers who achieved great notoriety and mobilized mass followings. The growing authority of these prophetic figures was not effectively checked by local political leaders. Rather, the religious figures and their allies assumed increasingly important roles as alternatives to traditional elites and managed to cast themselves as the champions of local liberties over and against political actors who often aspired to more centralized control that were seeking to dominate the cities. In all three of these cases, the conflict between the city and these outside forces led to war, and the ensuing struggles only reinforced the power of the city's charismatic religious leaders. Using biblical language to recast their military conflicts as either new iterations of Israelite holy wars or premonitions of imminent apocalyptic battles, Florence became the earthly incarnation of the heavenly Jerusalem, Prague, a new Zion, and the Anabaptist kingdom of Münster, the Davidic monarchy redivivus. Certainly, I'll have more to say about the specifics of these cities and the particular way in which each adapted the script of urban Christian revolution. But at this moment, I hope it will suffice to say that the influence of prophetic preachers, when combined with very real concerns over the independence of a city, were synthesized over and again during the 15th and 16th centuries to create a potent ideological blend that catalyzed revolutionary action across the full geographic and confessional spectrum of Europe. Okay. In order to argue that the radical urban reformations of the 15th and 16th centuries should be counted as revolutions, I suppose I must define that term. So let's do that by employing the criteria put forward by Hannah Arendt in a book entitled On Revolution, which she wrote in 1963. Now, the text, of course, is not Arendt's best-known work. It's not even her most famous book from that Annus Mirabilis. That honor would go to Eichmann in Jerusalem, which Arendt published serially in The New Yorker and used to introduce the world to her concept of the banality of evil embodied in the figure of Eichmann. But while her account of Eichmann's trial was essentially a case study in her theory of the impact of totalitarianism upon individuals who embrace submission to such regimes, On Revolution was a very different beast. It was a philosophical treatment of what revolution meant to those who participated in it that was couched in a historical analysis of the French and American revolutions. And I have to say, as a piece of historiography, as a critical historical treatment of these revolutions, the book is, I think, a failure. It received highly critical reviews from leading scholars such as Eric Hobsbawm, who thought it was ridiculously naive, and also called attention to certain errors of fact that sort of riddled the text. And Hobsbawm's review, and others like it, really limited the book's impact on the social scientific study of revolutions. But what this wave of negative reaction missed, and this has sort of been recovered by later generations of scholars, was how Arendt's central focus in the text could complement and augment the comparative analysis of revolutions so popular in other fields. She didn't focus on the structural inequalities and immediate crises that caused revolutions, or on the stages that revolutions pass through from their origins to their culmination, hopefully in the foundations of new regimes. These were the concerns of sociologists and political scientists. Instead, Arendt was interested in the revolutionaries' self-perception as their movements unfolded. How did they legitimize their uprisings, perceive their progress, and seek to preserve their gains through political arrangements for the future? And what exactly did revolutionaries think they were doing as they removed the traditional vessels of authority in their respective societies and replaced them with new institutions and ideologies? Arendt's answers to these questions were, I think, quite profound, so I'll work through them at a little bit of length here. For Arendt, the key to revolution was that its primary concern was freedom and not just liberation. She argued that liberation was a negative value. You could be liberated from tyranny, for instance, without any plan for what came next. Freedom, however, was intrinsically positive. To seek it demanded that a group of people search out or create spaces in which they could gain an active voice and concrete role in shaping their society. Now, I must say that Arendt defined such spaces very idiosyncratically. She used this term to describe institutions of representative government that afforded a wider public a role in politics. But I would not want the sort of narrowness of the way she uses that terminology to obscure the larger point, namely that revolutions enabled the admission of a wide swath of a given population into the public realm so they might exercise a new freedom in recreating politics. That element of newness was also central to Arendt's, it's sort of the most limiting aspect of Arendt's definition of revolution. She insisted that revolutions were founded upon the sense that something genuinely novel was occurring, an interruption in the cycles of human history that had typified the past. It was this effort to constitute a novus ordo seclorum, as she put it, that defined a revolution's quest for freedom. Arendt was clear that most revolutionaries began without this grand aspiration, but typically thought of themselves working through a reparation or a restoration or a reformation to gain lost legal rights or to return their society to a past golden age. But according to Arendt, this desire for restitution soon gave way to a more expansive vision. As, quote, it was the task of the revolutions to establish a new authority, unaided by custom and precedent and the halo of immemorial time. Throughout On Revolution, Arendt was clear that the establishment of a genuinely new freedom was never accomplished easily. The threat to entrenched powers was too great, and the uncertainty of revolution's outcome too dismaying to those privileged by the status quo. Revolutions therefore entailed violence as a means of effecting change. There was no way around it, and the more pressing question was whether the leaders of a given revolution could create checks that would prevent the violent impulses of the revolutionary masses from consuming the movement itself. More on that in a moment. So, to put it bluntly, freedom, novelty, and violence. This was Arendt's trinity of revolution, or as she put it herself, only where change occurs in the sense of a new beginning, where violence is used to constitute an altogether different form of government, to bring about the formation of a new body politic, where the liberation from oppression aims at least at the constitution of freedom, can we speak of revolution. Now, one of the aspects of Arendt's work on revolution that I find sort of most incisive is the attention she paid to a paradox at the heart of revolutions, and she calls this the perplexity of foundation. This phrase referred to the challenge that the founders of revolutionary movements faced in legitimizing their right to create a legitimately new framework for politics and society, but then denying or at least limiting that right for future generations. For Arendt, one of the greatest threats that revolutions faced was their potential for becoming permanent, forever locked in a cycle of overturning, destroying what they just created. And she thought that the best counter to this threat was the establishment of strong institutions that stabilized the political gains of revolution, allowed for sort of further adjustments or tweaks to the system, and resisted constant or systematic recreation. It's funny, when she talks about this, it's very unrevolutionary. It's bureaucratic, it's administrative. If we were thinking with Weber, it's institutionalization. But for her, this is essential. You have to translate the push for something new into something lasting, or else a revolution is sort of bound to fail. But Arendt, who considered revolutions to have been a sort of key agent in the secularization of Western societies was attuned to how difficult it was for revolutionary leaders to say, enough is enough. Without the sanction of tradition, which they had destroyed, or the sanctity of divine will backing them up, revolutionaries had to create a new vocabulary that reified their legitimacy, a fountainhead of justice, in Arendt's words, that could serve as the foundation of a new steady state. And I was thinking about this today during our couple of papers on the French Revolution, where there's this goal to sort of transmute or translate traditional religious ideas into a new sort of sanction for revolutionary institutions and ideas. All right. So why could Christianity not serve as such a foundation? Arendt is very, very clear that it could not. It clearly claimed to have divine truth on its side, and Jesus' teachings included enough subversive elements to be interpreted by his contemporaries as a threat to the political and religious status quo. But for Arendt, Christianity after Christ had always been trapped in a sort of cyclical view of history that could not imagine or encompass something new, different, positive. Since the incarnations, Christians were caught up in a holding pattern and awaiting the end of time. What I would argue that Arendt missed, and I think, again, this audience will be very attuned to this, was how close that end of time could appear and how alluring was the call to usher it in. The revolutionary appeal of Christianity was that it enabled its partisans to embed themselves in the apocalyptic scenarios that were teased in the biblical books of Daniel and Revelation. One could always heed the call of the two witnesses from Revelation 11, or rise up to oppose the forces of the Antichrist, Gog and Magog. And this was the potential revolutionary core to the Christian tradition. It provided its own symbolically rich script for evolution that made the stakes of resistance and political recreation eternal, and that prophesied the inbreaking of a radically, absolutely new world order in its wake. And so, while I think that Arendt undersold the revolutionary potential of Christianity to depict and consequently demand the creation of a new worldly order in service to a divine vision, I'm still convinced that her analysis of revolutionary self-consciousness can be fruitfully applied to the early modern religious radicals. Okay, I will, at the risk of repeating myself, just briefly. Freedom, novelty, and violence. These are the crucial components of Arendt's definition of revolution. So I want to use these motifs to guide a sort of ending consideration of the ideologies and practices that characterized the revolutionary regimes in Prague, Florence, and Münster. In doing so, I'm going to sort of bounce thematically back and forth between the cities rather than going through them at length as I did at the beginning, so we can see the ways that these different themes are sort of being recapitulated or worked out or sort of struggled with in the context of these three cities. So first and foremost, it behooves us to see if Christian radicals could move beyond liberty in search of freedom. In the case of Florence, I think the quest was evident, as Savonarola repeatedly entreated his listeners to rebuild the institutions of representative government that had been subverted, he said, by the ascendance of the Medici, while simultaneously pushing for a stronger executive power in the city by calling for the creation of an office comparable to that of the Venetian Doge. This latter position would encourage stability. It was actually created as the sort of lifetime gonfalonier of justice, while the former institutions would offer the potential for meaningful participation in government by a sort of broad group of the city's male population, which had been lost in the Medici's cronyism. But Savonarola did not frame such suggestions in merely pragmatic terms. Rather, he called upon Florence to be ruled by a spiritual regime, characterized by prayer and upright living, so the city might flourish as Israel had under Joshua and Gideon. Or, as Savonarola put it in a sermon from December of 1494, the old recedes and all is made new. Let everything be renewed in the form which will be imposed, which will make everyone secure. Of course, the guarantor that this change would conform to God's will was the prophet, who had proven his ability to discern divine commands. It was now up to the people of Florence to act accordingly, to grasp their freedom and select the form of government that seemed best to them, quote, and to have no doubt that the one thus selected will come from God. A similar drive to install a government that respected and encouraged the freedom of the people, I think, was there in Prague, although its scheme for a new power structure was less articulate than that in Florence. Yes, the Hussites immediately reconstituted the city council that they had thrown out the window in late July, but it's not clear that such a council was meant to bear any kind of sort of sacred or ultimate authority. Instead, I would suggest it was service among the Hussite warriors of God, especially during the sort of First Crusade, and participation in public processions and the celebration of communion in both kinds that marked a new kind of sort of public participatory politics. Maybe not a new kind, but an intensified version of what had been happening for the past few years. It was also the people's and their political leaders' refusal to recognize Sigismund's claim to the throne of Bohemia and continued adherence to the leadership of Zalewski and other Hussite preachers that raised up alternative loci of authority in the city. Much Hussite propaganda from this time highlighted Sigismund's anti-majesty, his sort of innate incapacity for the throne, and the investment of sovereignty in the Czech people or the Czech nation itself. And while I'm sure there will be questions about the exact meaning of those terms in this context, people and nation, I would highlight at this point that in songs, sermons, and manifestos from these years, Hussite ideologues were proposing new foundations for political identity. They were imagined in direct contradiction to the king as a result of his opposition to the Hussites' religious program. Now, I will admit, finding freedom in Arendt's sense of the word is admittedly harder in Münster. The rule of Jan van Leyden was too megalomaniacal, too obsessed with creating a theater state around his performance of sacred kingship to allow for the creation of a truly public realm. And yet, throughout his reign in the city, there were moments when alternate voices were raised to seize some role in the apocalyptic drama that was unfolding. For instance, there was the lame goldsmith Johann de Censure, who claimed to be a prophet and was recognized as such even by van Leyden, and spoke in favor of van Leyden's changes in the city. There was the former mayor, Bernard Nieperdolink, who alternately challenged but then served as the executioner for his new king, and, my personal favorite, the Dutch emigre Phillip Haberkern. Phillip Haberkern, inspired by the story of Judith and Holofernes and the siege of Bethulia, proposed to the leaders of Anabaptist Münster that she would bring a gift. She would infiltrate the camp and the court of Bishop Franz von Waldeck, who was leading the army besieging the city, and she would embrace him with a poisoned shirt, thus killing him and ending the threat to the city. She made it out of the city. She made it through the lines. She got close to Waldeck, but alas, was not able to kill him. Here we have a painting by Lucas Cranach, the elder from 1530-ish, depicting Judith, and Phillip Haberkern next to her, who achieves a sort of lasting memory among Anabaptists as someone who made this sort of heroic effort to save her city. I would also point out, just for the sake of interest, that these pictures of Judith and Holofernes' head are incredibly popular in the 16th century. The Cranach workshop did dozens, and they were most popular as wedding presents. All right, we'll sort of leave that alone for now. These people did not enjoy the sort of institutional freedom as Arendt envisioned it, but they did take advantage of Anabaptist Münster's fluid, imaginative political environment to create and to carve out active roles for themselves. They created spaces for meaningful political action, in Arendt's terms, spaces that were opened up by the dominant apocalyptic and prophetic tenor of the city. So if the freedom aspect of Münster is difficult, the novelty is much easier. Everything in Münster was made new in the years 1534 and 1535, and all of the changes were understood in an explicitly apocalyptic manner. New laws were passed to regulate family and economic life, including the naming of babies born in the city. Münster's streets and gates were given new names, as were the public squares in the city. Houses and city districts were sort of planned to be rebuilt. There was not time or sort of resources to actually do it. And as one Anabaptist reported during his interrogation after the city's fall, the town was to be called New Zion and New Jerusalem. All other towns will be punished, as it was written that in Zion alone will be salvation. And while all wealth was to be held in common, I lost the slide. And while all wealth was to be held in common in the city, new coins were issued, bearing the words, Das Wort ist Fleisch geworden, that served as a badge of affiliation to the Münsterite cause. To put it plainly, every aspect of public life in the city came to be regulated by new norms. They were justified by the adaptation of a biblical apocalyptic script to the exigencies of city life under siege. every decision the Munsterites made was geared toward ushering in a new redeemed world centered on the city. Although the language used by Savonarola was less overtly apocalyptic than the symbolic and architectural discourse employed by the leaders of Munster, he was no less committed to the construction of a new sacred political order in Florence. Old Testament prophetic imagery predominated in Savonarola's description of the renewed republic that was arising on the banks of the Arno River, with the Dominican himself taking on the mantle of divinely inspired leadership. In his sermons from November of 1494, for instance, Savonarola repeatedly described Florence as the Ark from Genesis 6. Just as Noah and his family had survived the flood to repopulate the earth and begin anew, so too would the people of Florence survive the French flood to renew God's church. I'm mixing up my cultural context here. This is from the Veleslav Picture Bible. We talked about it earlier today, and its illuminations are lovely. I thought I'd include them for Noah and his family. Savonarola also used the image of a heart to encapsulate Florence's coming role. Renewal had become there, and it would pump out from the city to circulate through the entire Italian peninsula to bring about the erection of a godly ecclesiastical order. In his Advent sermons from the same year, Savonarola subtly wove in references to Florence as a new Jerusalem, but not in the sense of John's Revelation. Rather, Savonarola preached on the book of Haggai, positioning himself in the place of the prophet who led the rebuilding of God's temple, just as this Israelite prophet had after the Babylonian captivity. By assuming this role and thereby marking his audience as the new chosen people of God, the Dominican preacher was recasting the political drama unfolding in Florence as a reenactment of biblical events. After years of captivity and moral decay under Medici power, the city had the opportunity to build new structures, both ecclesiastical and political, that would allow the Florentines to fulfill their divine destiny. Now, for those in the audience who have participated in the workshop over the last couple of days or who are engaged in Hussite studies, there is, I think, no need for me to discuss the Hussite revolutionaries' conviction that they were creating a new divine order at length. Both Martin and Pavlina illuminated the expectations that the Hussites had for the imminent inbreaking of a godly reality, even as they highlighted the different and evolving concepts of human agency that would usher in the expected new age. So all I will add to their discussion here is an emphasis on the ways in which Jan Żelivský highlighted the people of Prague's role in this unfolding drama. In the summer of 1419, Żelivský routinely referred to the Communitas Pragensis as a new Zion and a city on a hill, framing the Hussites' conflict with Sigismund as one between the faithful elect and the apocalyptic red dragon of Revelation 14. Żelivský also, like Savonarola, likened himself to the Hebrew prophets, particularly Moses, because he was revealing the law of God to the people, and Elisha, because he had inherited a double portion of the Spirit from the person he identified as the new Elijah, Jan Hus. And while I'm focusing here on the idea of sort of novelty and an imminent apocalyptic transformation within the city of Prague, I'd be remiss not to mention the creation of an entirely new city, Tabor, as a refuge for the Hussites' expected apocalyptic conflict. As in Anabaptist Munster a century later, Tabor was meant to serve as a physical embodiment of eschatological aspirations. It was named, after all, for the site traditionally associated with the transfiguration of Christ. And thus, the Hussite commune anticipated a similar transformation of the world into something brand new. It must also be said that Tabor as Munster was built for war, that both the Hussite revolutionaries and the Munsterites understood the necessity of violence for ushering in their new ages is self-evident. And while Savonarola's Florence never went on the war path to effect the renewal of Italy, its development was entirely influenced by the outbreak of the Italian wars and the sort of dynamics of the city within this larger conflict. So while I do not want to belabor the point or tax your patience so much, I would simply say that the ideological leaders of the Hussites, including Jan Żelivský and the Munsterite Anabaptists, especially Bernd Rothmann, expended much intellectual energy in framing violence as a necessary step in the purification of the world in preparation for the eschaton. For Rothmann in particular, the rise of the new Davidic kingdom in Munster was very much depicted as preparatory. The gathering of the elect and their subsequent eradication of the powers of the world was meant to pave the way for the true Solomon, as he put it, that would be Christ, who will come in his wisdom, peace, and all his glory to rule over his kingdom, so that all will occur and be fulfilled, which the prophets have proclaimed to the world. It'd be interesting to know how or if this language would have softened over time, as we might see occurring in Hussite apocalyptic rhetoric. Something like this happened with the death of Jan Mathis, an assumption of power van Leyden is actually an intensification. But the Munsterites never had the opportunity, or perhaps faced the necessity, of adapting their expectations to the unfolding course of events. The city fell before its schema could be truly tested, overwhelmed by the forces that the city had been constructed to resist and overcome. Now, I was both quite impressed and quite alarmed yesterday evening when my colleague Matthias Riedel offered a precise date for the birth of Christian revolutionary thinking, or maybe its full expression. July 13th, 1524, he said, when Thomas Müntzer delivered his bombastic sermon to the princes. I was impressed because of Professor Riedel's precision, his boldness, and persuasive power in making this argument. I was alarmed because our dating doesn't match up. But while I would push the date for the rise of revolutionary Christianity back into the 15th century, I think that Matthias and I essentially agree that radical religious visions for the total transformation of the worldly order emerged sort of at the end of the Middle Ages, the beginning of the early modern era, and that Christianity had much in its symbolic and intellectual bag of tricks that could be used to justify these efforts. What I've tried to argue tonight is that radical change was not the property of any particular Christian confession or national tradition. And I think we could expand this out across the 16th century to see the Reformed, the Lutheran, Arch-Catholics of the Holy League in the city of Paris. Again, every confession is participating, claiming the revolutionary sort of core of Christian ideology. Excuse me. But that the potential for this sort of revolutionary potentia existed as a latent force across Christendom that could be activated by the confluence of particular sets of circumstances around military and political conflict and the actions of figures who claimed prophetic insight and urgency for their missions. I've kept my focus on cities this evening as privileged sites for the awakening of Christianity's revolutionary potential, as the stages upon which prophetic apocalyptic scripts for revolution were acted out. I think this is justified because cities had traditions of independence and self-government that could be harnessed to Christian revolutionary thought, and because the cities contain the sort of critical intellectual demographic mass to give shape to revolutionary action. But I would not make any exclusive claims for cities and their role in revolutions at this point. To do so would be to ignore the social and political constellations outside city walls that could give rise to collective action, as Benjamin Heidenreich argued so eloquently this afternoon. So to conclude this evening, I'll return to Hannah Arendt, whose assertions about revolutionary self-consciousness and the temporal limits on revolution initially provoked this paper. I began by really wanting to use Arendt's own ideas against her, to take her criteria for revolutions and demonstrate that certain late medieval and early modern radical reform movements counted, despite her explicit claims to the contrary. But somewhere along the sort of path, the very winding, wandering path of writing this paper, I realized that performing this sort of historiographical gotcha really it missed the point. I think that Arendt would probably be pleased that scholars of another age and shaped by different intellectual traditions and questions would take up her project of searching out and expanding the ideological and political frameworks of revolution, of trying to capture the ways in which people expressed their excitement, anticipation, and fears about creating something new. So while I ultimately disagree with Arendt the historian, I must confess my agreement with Arendt as a philosopher, who saw clearly that revolutions were, quote, precisely the legendary hiatus between end and beginning, between a no longer and a not yet. All I would argue that she needed was to recognize the sort of deeply eschatological potential, the Christian potential for theological rendering and understanding of this, her own language, as the underpinnings of late medieval and early modern revolution. Thank you.
Really, really interesting. And some real food for thought there. I've just got one question, which is, why have you chosen to use Arendt's definition, framework, rather than whichever other one you like?
one reason is because sort of her notoriety, right? Like this is a major sort of public intellectual figure of the mid-20th century, and I was asked to sort of give a more public-facing talk. And so part of it really was like this idea of how appealing she was as a name. And so that was the starting point. And then I started to sort of read On Revolution and all of the critical reviews of it and all of the exhaustive and exhausting books written by her critics, presenting categories and taxonomies and stages of development and schemas for revolutionary development that were smart, but I found, quite frankly, overwhelming and less interesting, because there's a sort of constant qualification or clarification of taxonomies that at some point it's almost like, what are we doing with this? So I actually ended up with Arendt because of the simplicity of it, and because she has these criteria which she works through sort of on this deep, again, sort of philosophical level, but can be expanded on sort of endlessly. So it was, in some sense, the frustrations I felt, or not frustrations, but the perception of the limitations of the definition and feeling like there was space to work around it. So I am not claiming that it is the best definition of revolution. I am not, although anytime you read these books, they always say, well, there's no easy way to define revolution. This is Eric Hobsbawm. So I will spend the next 70 pages defining revolution. And that to me is unsatisfying. So instead, I sort of preferred, again, the sort of simplicity, and I thought the incisive sort of power of Arendt, but without the sort of exhausting need for stages and lists of causes, and why one crisis in one situation spurs a revolution, but the same crisis in another situation does not. So it's maybe an unsatisfying intellectual answer, but that's how I went. That's how I decided.
I found, you said right at the beginning, would have been interesting, maybe Arendt would have read Eric Vogel. She actually did. Mm-hmm. And there is a correspondence,
yes,
actually debate between the two, which was published in the Review of Politics.
Nice. On
precisely that question. Therefore, I think she's actually a very good choice in the sense that she quite radically rejects the Christian origins of revolutionary thought.
Yes.
Which I think is even kind of ridiculous in the American sense of the American Revolution, where the Bible is clearly more important than but it's interesting. She has a footnote there somewhere in the book where she reacts to. This is of course this German immigrant community that writes to each other, Karl Löwit and Leo Strauss, and Löwit and Vogel argue for Joachim of Fiore and the Christian apocalyptic heritage of revolutionary thought. And she has a footnote somewhere that's really disturbing in a way. She rejects that, also saying that she cannot see more in this apocalyptic tradition than hysteria. That's her word. So it's something like a mass hysteria. And if I remember correctly. And that's interesting. And then the question is if, let's say, this is not just a historical but also philosophical failure in a way. But we can discuss, on the other hand, I would say, of course, her model of the revolution is based on a classical understanding of politics that she takes mainly from the polis.
Oh, yes.
And which gives her a certain understanding of what revolution should be about. On the other hand, and that's what I was hoping to say, if you look at these apocalyptic thinkers, we sometimes forget these people were also trained humanists. And that's not only true for Münzer. If you look at Savonarola, you are the example, and read his treatise on the Constitution of Florence. It's Aristotle. Aristotle's politics, up and down.
Oh, yes.
And so this is also interesting, how these basically classical civic traditions and also humanist tradition come together with these apocalyptic moments in the revolutionary situations.
Yeah, no, I was opening up my notes because I thought I remembered the passage, but at one point she talks about sort of Christian attempts at revolution and ultimately sort of dismisses them as politically without consequences and historically futile. Right? So like there is a sort of out of hand idea that this can't possibly happen, and it's clearly more of a sort of personal intellectual blind spot, I think, from this wider dialogue she's participating in, where I think that's a sort of starting first principle for her, that Christianity cannot be revolutionary. which is a limitation. But what's fascinating, as you said, with the American Revolution, one of her big things, this goes back to the idea of the script, is that the great failure of modern revolutions is that they all want to be like France when they should all want to be like America, because the Americans are boring. And at a certain point, instead of trying to say, let's make all men equal, let's eradicate poverty, let's create a nation of equality, they say, let's build things that will keep this together with a more sort of modest definition. And she has an interesting take on basically how there's the lack of a critical mass of abject, impoverished people in America during, well, anyway. So she has this idea that there's actually something to this, but as you say, she's missing sort of some of the underlying really important sort of religious connotations, sort of substance of the thought that underwrites the American revolutionary sort of effort. Not that I'm here to say yay America. That's generally not a good idea when you're the sole American in the room. But anyway, no, it's quite interesting. I think you are right about the sort of classical elements that she misses, even as she recapitulates many of them herself in sort of political thought. So.
I don't know if you are acquainted with the work of the Czech Marxist scholar Robert Kalivoda.
Mm-hmm.
You are?
Yes.
Oh, okay, because his work was not translated into English, but just into German. So you know it.
Yes.
Oh, good, because I think that's perfectly in line with your lecture, because he finds the society revolution to be the early form of the bourgeois revolution. Which is the Marxist terminology for the modern time revolution.
Mm-hmm.
He says that the radical wing of the society revolution, so the Taborists, are the first historical example of the romantic revolutionary idea of the sudden introduction of a new moral order of a new better society.
Mm-hmm.
Which then is repeated in the Minster's revolution, and then it goes up to the Jacobins in the French Revolution. So I'm very glad to hear from your mouth something similar as Kalivoda did, if I understood it.
Well, it's interesting because I think if we start to sort of, I would hesitate to elevate sort of the class conflict elements of this too much. Because like, for instance, if you look in Münster, yes, you have this sort of influx of Dutch Anabaptists, but most of the people in the city who stay and assume powerful roles, even in the Davidic monarchy, are the more traditional elites from the city. So it's not a sort of class uprising in that particular case. The same thing is true in Florence, where yes, the Piagnoni do attract some sort of lower class people, but a lot of the people who are working most closely with Savonarola are also sort of traditional urban elites who have been on the outs with the Medici and have sort of been waiting and adopting so we can question their motives, their assumption of the sort of revolutionary mantle or their motivations for doing it. But I do think that what's really powerful in someone like Kalivoda, or this idea of the confluence of ideological and then more economic and social concerns in these early revolutions, again, is how kind of capacious Christian ideology is. It can accept those, it can take those in. It has the intellectual or symbolic resources to integrate the need for the common chest and communitarian impulses, but also allow in sort of political elites who are sort of committed to changing the world. So I think that to me is kind of the most interesting piece of this, is not a sort of necessarily sort of dominant kind of Marxist reading of these, but the idea that within this umbrella of Christian revolutionary thought, you can assume the economic and you can assume the social, but also very different motivations as well. So, all right, anyone else?
Nevertheless, you titled your lecture, When Did Christianity Become Revolutionary? So I'd like to ask, your answer was 15, 16th centuries. I can accept this for the Middle Ages. I think it would have something to do with the urban element you also mentioned, because in all the Middle Ages there probably was not nothing. But my question is, what about late antiquity? I don't have a counterexample. I'm just wondering if there is anything comparable, or the other suggestion, if you open the door of revolution as definition for Christianity, you can easily come to the not so late antiquity, namely to the very beginning of Christian church. So how would you incorporate, or how would you deal with this? I think this is not an unfair question.
No, I think it's a really interesting question, because whereas I do think there is this sort of, there's clearly something happening, and it accelerates with the outbreak of the sort of European Reformations in the beginning of the 16th century, where these types of things are happening more and more often in more and more places. So I think there is something about the sort of late 15th and early 16th century is going on. And I'll be honest, I actually, I thought, I did some digging about this sort of late antiquity and sort of whether or not we could think about Christian Revolution, and the short answer is I don't know enough to say for sure. I don't know if there are places where we would look at the sort of conflict in North Africa in the 3rd and 4th century, if there are things that qualify. If somebody stood up and said, Carthage 340, look it up on Wikipedia, I'm utterly willing to be convinced that the potential is there much earlier. I don't know about it, and I didn't see a lot of people claiming it. And so, particularly, I think that if anything, really, Christianity in its earliest decades and centuries, I'm not sure it's particularly revolutionary. Judaism certainly is, in its own way. So I think that it's, again, within the tradition, these resources are there. But I don't know. I did some looking, but I didn't really. I don't know. I didn't find anything that quite felt right. And again, I would be happily corrected on this if someone would say, "Oh, you really must consider this." Same thing within the East. I don't know enough about the history of sort of Orthodox Christianity to find this there either. But I would love for this data set of Christian revolutions to expand. I would be all for that, I think.
I can think about Engels. For Engels, there was a revolutionary potential in early Christianity. So he claims it for Engels.
So does he ever talk about it being enacted? Because that to me is the sort of interesting thing in these three places, is how we see sort of different takes on that potential, but sustained efforts to actually undertake and complete revolutions. I mean, I think the thing I had meant to include it in the conclusion, I didn't, but I'll acknowledge it here, is I do think that in two of the cases at least, the reason why people don't always talk about Savonarola and his Florence as revolutionary or Anabaptist is because they fail fairly spectacularly, right? They are relatively short-lived, although Florence, the Florentine sort of political experiment lasts a little bit longer. The Hussites are successful in most respects. So I would acknowledge that, in all of these cases, it's maybe one of the reasons that these things would say on the list of potential but not accomplished is because Münster is 18 months. Savonarola is really ascendant for 4 years. So there is, and he's even in trouble for the last of those 4. So there's an interesting kind of question of how long does something have to last to really be revolutionary, which I think it's an interesting question, and it's something I need to think more about kind of individually about what it takes to sort of count. Because one of the things I was quite struck with, and I'll just refer back to last night's address, was this idea of the universal scope of revolution. And while I do think we see that in early Hussitism, I think we definitely see that, or universal pretension, I would say, among the Anabaptists. It's not clear, for instance, that Savonarola ever has that sense. He thinks a reform will sort of take place, but he's not looking to overturn the power structures in all the other Italian cities. Or at least it doesn't seem to be the sort of realistic plan. So that's another one, both the how long they last and how widely they imagine the arena in which they're acting, where I think there's some interesting, I'm going to challenge my own conclusions, but I think there are some ways to sort of to trouble what I'm saying based on those kind of qualifications as well.